June 1944. Normandy burned beneath a sky bruised with smoke. The thunder of artillery rolled endlessly, shaking the ground like a heartbeat gone mad. British and Canadian units, once triumphant after D-Day, now bled across the hedgerows of France. The German counterattack had come like a storm, swift, relentless, unyielding. Villages liberated only days before were swallowed again by chaos. Major Alan Reeves stood in the shattered ruins of a farmhouse, map spread across a blood-stained table. Outside, the distant rattle of machine guns echoed through the valley. Reports from the front were worse than anyone dared admit. Entire battalions were breaking apart. Communications had collapsed. Between the screaming radios and desperate messengers, one word began to whisper through the ranks: collapse. Reeves traced the front line with trembling fingers. Every position was falling back, every defense crumbling under pressure. But in the static-filled darkness of the radio tent, a voice spoke of something different, a coded transmission mentioning Operation Veil. No one knew what it meant, only that it came from high command, and only to selected Canadian officers. Rumors spread like fire among the men. A shadow unit was being assembled, unseen and unacknowledged, to plug the holes no one else could. Reeves didn't believe in ghosts, but in that hour of desperation, he found himself waiting for one. Outside, the horizon glowed red with burning fuel depots. The stench of cordite and wet soil filled the air. Reeves lifted his eyes toward the smoke-choked dawn, knowing that history would remember Normandy as victory. But tonight, it felt like defeat. Somewhere in the silence between artillery shells, a truth emerged. The British line was dying, and only ghosts could save it. The air inside headquarters was thick with smoke and sweat. Maps fluttered on the walls, corners curled from the heat of nearby lamps. Outside, the sky pulsed red from burning supply trucks, their fuel tanks exploding in dull, rhythmic bursts. Major Reeves pushed through the haze, boots slick with mud and ash, as an orderly thrust a sealed envelope into his hands. Top priority. Eyes only. He broke the wax seal and unfolded the thin paper. The words were few, the meaning opaque. Form a detachment of 700 officers. No insignia, no record. Operation Veil begins at dawn. No signature. No instructions. Reeves frowned. The order felt wrong, like something whispered, not written. Around him, men moved in silence, haunted by exhaustion. In the corner, a radio operator adjusted dials, static hissing like breath through clenched teeth. No contact from HQ east of Caen, he muttered. Lines are dead. Paranoia seeped through the camp like gas. Rumors spread of infiltrators, of spies wearing Allied uniforms. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. Reeves glanced at the faces around him. Captains, lieutenants, clerks, all too young, too tired, too afraid. Yet these were the men he would lead into an operation no one could explain. A gust of wind swept through the broken window, carrying the stench of burning oil. Reeves looked out across the darkening fields. Somewhere out there, beyond the chaos, 700 names were being erased from official ledgers, men who would exist only in whispers. He folded the paper again, tucking it inside his coat. Whatever Operation Veil was, it carried the weight of desperation, the kind of mission that never reached history books. As the night deepened, Reeves gathered his officers by lantern light, their faces pale in the flicker. "We move before dawn," he said quietly, "and no one must know why." By dawn, the fields of Normandy looked like the edge of hell. Smoke clung to the horizon in heavy bands, broken only by the silhouettes of shattered tanks and the twisted frames of villages that no longer had names. Major Reeves led his convoy through the wreckage. 700 Canadian officers disguised among British infantry. Unmarked trucks rumbling down roads slick with rain and blood. They passed through what was left of Tilly-sur-Seulles, once a town, now a graveyard of stone and steel. A church steeple leaned sideways, its bell silent. Civilians hid in cellars, eyes wide with the dull terror of those who'd seen too much. The Canadians moved quietly, never identifying themselves, answering questions with half-truths and coded nods. They weren't supposed to exist. Every mile felt heavier. The mud swallowed boots, dragging at their legs. The smell of fuel and decay coated the air, a reminder that the front was no longer a line but a blur. Reeves stopped by a wrecked carrier, its crew burned beyond recognition. He removed his cap for a moment, not out of ceremony but exhaustion. Around him the officers pressed forward, merging seamlessly with retreating British platoons. Morale had crumbled. Men spoke of withdrawal in whispers. Commanders barked orders no one obeyed. But amid the chaos, Reeves's unmarked unit moved differently. Calm, deliberate, invisible. They patched communications, reinforced crumbling positions, and vanished before dawn. To the soldiers they aided, they were phantoms. Nameless figures who appeared in smoke and left only the faint echo of discipline behind. As night fell, Reeves wrote his first report on damp paper by lantern light. "We hold the line for now. But if we fall, no one will remember us." He folded it carefully, sealing it with wax melted from a spent candle. Outside, the inferno raged on, and within it, 700 ghosts worked to keep history from collapsing. The plan came together under a canopy of smoke and secrecy. Operation Veil was not about firepower. It was about deception. The 700 Canadian officers, trained in communications and field tactics, were about to fight a war made of shadows and sound. Major Reeves stood in a field tent lit by a single oil lamp, tracing lines on a map pinned with black string. "We make them believe we're 10 times our size," he murmured. Around him, officers scribbled coordinates and call signs. The hum of radios filled the air, not for contact but for illusion. They would flood German frequencies with false reports of incoming divisions, armored reinforcements, and phantom artillery strikes. Every voice transmission, every signal burst was a weapon. At dawn, the first phase began. Static crackled across enemy receivers as false British units reported their positions. Inflatable decoy tanks were dragged into position under camouflage nets, their rubber skins gleaming in the mist. At a distance, through enemy binoculars, they looked real enough. Motorcycles raced back and forth, mimicking the movements of non-existent brigades. Even the sound of engines was faked. Amplifiers hidden in the hedgerows broadcast the thunder of advancing armor that did not exist. By noon, German scouts were reporting a massive buildup near Caen. Fear did the rest. Commanders hesitated, artillery fire shifted, and the Canadian front, once on the brink of collapse, began to breathe again. Reeves watched from a ridge, his binoculars trembling slightly. "We're not fighting men anymore," he whispered to his adjutant. "We're fighting their imagination." That night, as the rain fell over Normandy, enemy shells landed harmlessly in empty fields where the decoys stood. The Canadians worked silently, repositioning fake convoys, keeping the illusion alive. To the Germans, the Allies had been reborn. To history, Operation Veil would never exist. Reeves closed his journal with ink-stained fingers, writing only one line before the candle burned out. "We built ghosts, and the ghosts held the line." By the third week of Operation Veil, the illusion had become too real. Major Reeves sat alone in the dim glow of his tent, the sound of distant shell fire mixing with the rhythmic tap of rain on canvas. Reports piled high on his table. Coded transmissions, falsified maps, and casualty lists written in invisible ink. Each page bore the same quiet weight. Men dying in a war that would never acknowledge them. 7 of his officers had been captured during a diversion near Hill 112. The Germans, convinced they had taken key Allied strategists, had halted their advance to interrogate them. Reeves knew what that pause meant. The illusion was working, but it also meant those men would vanish into enemy prisons, tortured for lies they'd been ordered to tell. He stared at their names for a long time before crossing them out. No one outside this tent would ever read them again. At night, Reeves dreamt of the Germans they deceived, young soldiers retreating toward phantom divisions, surrendering to ghosts. One prisoner, a boy no older than 19, had begged for mercy when captured by a British patrol. He believed thousands of reinforcements were surrounding him. Reeves watched as the truth dawned on the prisoner's face. There were no reinforcements, no massive army, just the echo of their trickery. The boy wept, not from fear but from humiliation. The victory felt hollow. Reeves's men saved entire regiments by lying, but every lie cost a piece of their humanity. "We're ghosts, sir," one officer had said quietly. And ghosts don't get remembered. That night, Reeves poured himself a cup of cold tea, staring at the flicker of a candle burning low. He had built an army of phantoms, and they had held the line, but at a cost no one would ever pay tribute to. When the war ended, medals would be handed to others. His men would disappear into classified files and silence. He raised his cup in the dark, a toast to the unseen. "To the men who saved the living," he murmured, "by dying in secret." By the end of July, the fog of war had begun to shift, not from weather, but from illusion. The ghost divisions had done their work too well. British soldiers who days earlier whispered of retreat now shouted orders with renewed purpose. Convinced that thousands of reinforcements had arrived from the coast, the battlefield became a theater of smoke and echoes. Radios hissed with false chatter, calm, confident voices calling in imaginary artillery barrages. Alpha 4 advancing. Armor confirmed. Hold position. Every word was a spark to morale. Across the front, exhausted troops straightened their backs, eyes scanning the horizon for tanks that would never come. They believed they weren't alone, and belief, Reeves thought, was the most powerful weapon they had left. Rain poured over the fields, soaking the trenches until they resembled open graves. The air was thick with cordite and the iron stench of mud mixed with blood. Reeves moved through the command post, listening as his men adjusted dials and shuffled maps that represented lies drawn with precision. In the distance, artillery flares painted the sky, false signals, timed to perfection. Through the haze, the line held. German armor stalled, convinced the Allies had a second wave waiting to strike. Their commanders hesitated, probing the mist with caution. That hesitation saved thousands of lives. Reeves watched as a young British corporal climbed from his dugout, shouting, "They're falling back!" The cheer spread like wildfire through the ranks. Men laughed, wept, and fired into the fog with newfound fury. For the first time since Normandy, the British front didn't retreat. The illusion had become momentum. The fear had turned to faith. Reeves stood at the edge of a ruined farmhouse, rain dripping from his cap, as the thunder of distant artillery rumbled like a heartbeat. His adjutant approached. "Sir, they think we're winning." Reeves smiled faintly, exhausted. "Then let's make it true." In that moment, among smoke, rain, and shouted codes, the tide of war began to turn. Not through power, but through deception, courage, and the fragile strength of human belief. The illusion began to tremble the moment truth leaked through the cracks. A coded German transmission intercepted at dawn mentioned ghost battalions. Reeves's blood ran cold. Someone, somewhere had pieced together fragments of Operation Veil. In the gray morning light, he read the report again, the ink smudged by rain and sweat. "Enemy command suspects deception in the Can sector." One line. And the entire operation hung in the balance. Hours later, a captured German courier confirmed the worst. They had a spy within Allied lines. A single informant, disguised as a French liaison, had seen too much: decoy tanks being inflated at night, officers communicating from fake command posts, radios transmitting without troops to back them. If the Germans realized the extent of the ruse, the front would collapse overnight. Inside headquarters, Reeves faced his men. The air was thick with smoke and fear. "If this leaks," he said, voice low, "every soldier out there dies believing in ghosts." Silence followed. One of his senior aides asked, "Then we silence the truth?" Reeves didn't answer. He looked through the tent flap toward the rain-soaked fields, where the illusion still lived. Men laughing, fighting, surviving under a lie. The spy was caught before sundown. A young man, terrified, pleading that he was only following orders. Reeves dismissed the guards and spoke to him alone. The man swore the Germans already doubted the reports. Reeves stood there for a long time, then quietly ordered his transfer, not to a firing squad, but to a cell far from the front. "No one else needs to die for knowing too much," he said. That night, Reeves couldn't sleep. Lightning flashed outside his tent, revealing his reflection in a cracked mirror, a commander trapped between truth and survival. Operation Veil had saved thousands, but to keep saving them, he would have to bury honesty deeper than the dead. The storm broke just before midnight. Not rain this time, but fire. German artillery thundered across the valley, turning the Canadian positions into a storm of mud, smoke, and shattered earth. Reeves crouched behind a collapsed wall, radio pressed to his ear as false transmissions roared through the static. "Delta Company holding. Reinforcements en route!" The truth was harsher. There were no reinforcements. Only the men of Operation Veil standing alone between chaos and collapse. Flares streaked the sky, illuminating faces streaked with grime and fear. The Canadians fought like ghosts, moving through smoke and ruin, their rifles blazing against an enemy they could barely see. Every message they sent bought precious minutes for the British lines behind them. "Hold your ground," Reeves ordered, voice breaking. "They believe we're stronger than we are. Don't prove them wrong." By dawn, the field was a graveyard. The rain returned, washing blood into the earth, erasing uniforms and names alike. Reeves stumbled through the wreckage, his boots sinking in the mud as he counted the fallen. Captain Lane, his second-in-command, lay slumped beside a destroyed radio set, the same one that had broadcast hope through the night. Reeves knelt, placing a hand on the man's shoulder, whispering, "You held the line, old friend. They'll never know, but I will." Somewhere beyond the horizon, British tanks rolled forward, alive because of the ghosts who had stayed behind. The illusion had worked. German scouts, misled by the false chatter, believed they'd faced 3 times their number. Their attack faltered, then broke. As the first rays of light pierced the smoke, Reeves stood amid the silence, surrounded by men who had vanished from history the moment they saved it. He reached for his logbook and tore out the page that listed their names, classified, erased, untold. He whispered to the wind, "They'll call it a miracle, but we'll know what it cost." And in that gray morning over Normandy, where lies had saved the living, the last of Operation Veil's heroes faded, unrecorded, unseen, but victorious in silence. When the guns finally fell silent, the victor stepped forward, but not the right ones. A month after Operation Veil ended, the headlines blazed with triumph. British lines hold firm, heroic resistance at Normandy. Medals were pinned, speeches delivered, and names engraved into history. None of them belonged to Reeves or his 700 men. In the shadows of a damp operations tent, Reeves read the official report. Their mission didn't exist. The casualties, unidentified units. The transmissions, standard Allied coordination. It was as if Operation Veil had never happened. The signatures at the bottom of the report were crisp and clean, untouched by mud or grief. Reeves folded the paper carefully, his hands trembling. "We saved the line," he whispered, "and now we're ghosts." A week later, he attended a ceremony on the cliffs above the channel. Generals in polished boots and fresh uniforms saluted under a clear sky. Cameras clicked. The speeches praised the courage of the visible heroes. Reeves stood among the crowd, his coat still stained with Normandy's mud, watching medals gleam on men who had never seen the front collapse. Beside him, a surviving officer murmured, "Do we tell them?" Reeves shook his head. "No. That's not what we were sent for. Silence hung between them, the kind that only men who've buried truth can understand. As the band played God Save the King, Reeves looked toward the horizon where the gray sea met the mist. He could almost hear the static of the radios, the phantom voices that had once held a nation together. His chest tightened. Pride and grief bound inseparably. When the crowd dispersed, Reeves remained alone. The wind carried the faint echo of cheers, distant and hollow. He whispered into the salt air, "They'll never know who saved them." And maybe that's the point. In history's grand parade, the 700 would march unseen, their victory written only in silence. Decades later, history began to whisper what it once buried. In a quiet British archive, a researcher broke the seal on a faded folder stamped "Classified Operation Veil." Dust rose as the truth surfaced, 700 names, long erased, written in trembling ink. The reports told of false divisions, phantom signals, and a night that saved the British Army from collapse. Margins were marked with phrases like "unofficial casualties" and "no public acknowledgement." Newspapers called it the Ghost Battalion. Historians pieced together fragments, intercepted German logs, forged transmissions, and field diaries that never made it home. What emerged was not just strategy, but sacrifice. Men who fought an invisible war so that others could live to fight a visible one. Among the declassified files, one photograph stood out. A grainy image of Major Arthur Reeves standing beside a burned-out radio truck, his face half-lit by dawn. The caption read simply, "Unidentified Unit, Normandy Sector, June 1944." Across Canada and Britain, memorials began to appear, not grand statues or ceremonies, but plaques hidden in regimental halls, engraved with words that once defined their silence, for those who held the line without being seen. In a documentary interview, an elderly historian said softly, "These men saved a war without firing for glory. They proved that sometimes history's loudest echoes belong to those who never spoke." And in that truth, uncovered too late for medals, but not for memory, Major Reeves and his 700 ghosts finally stepped out from the shadows. The war they ended had already passed, but the silence they left behind became eternal proof. Unseen does not mean forgotten.